PTO standouts, rookies try and make the roster. There's a lot to like with the Carolina Hurricanes outside of them dropping another preseason game. This is about fighting for roster spots, and that's what this team right now in the preseason is doing with their players. They are fighting for roster spots. That being said, the roster is being trimmed before we get closer to the start of the 25-26 season. Who's staying right now and who's on their way to Chicago? All of that and more on the Tuesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes.
Your Locked On Hurricanes, your daily podcast on the Carolina Hurricanes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you to the Everyday for making this your first listen of the day, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, talking everything about your Carolina Hurricanes. I'm your host, Zach Martin. I'm the credentialed Carolina Hurricanes beat writer over at the Hawkers, also the co-host of the Surge Cast, which is a weekly Carolina Hurricanes podcast, along with all of my duties here at Locked On Hurricanes. On the Tuesday edition of the show, we're going to recap the penultimate, second to last, whatever you want to call it, preseason game for the Carolina Hurricanes as they lost 4-3 in overtime to the Florida Panthers. But there were some, the young players on that roster really stepped up and, forced their way into at least an overtime against the Panthers. Also going to talk about camp roster cuts as we have 7 players as of this recording that have been reassigned to the Chicago Wolves. And then as of the guys who are still up here right now, who is making the case to stay? Because there is a lot of guys with PTOs and young prospects that are trying to fight their way on to the roster. So coming into the game, you saw that with the Hurricanes going into South Florida that they brought Frederik Andersen and Alexander Nikishin. Those were your 2 mainstays when it came to the NHL roster. Then you had the, prospects and PTO guys who basically played all 5 preseason games. You're looking at Kevin LeBanc. You're looking at Oliver Shillington, Bradley Nadeau, guys like that. And you heard from, Mike Maniscalco and Chip Tracy through the broadcast if you were watching the stream on Hurricanes.com, and it was the fact that preseason games, the results don't really matter. You're not going to go and try and be the preseason champion because we all know that doesn't really matter. It's mainly about to see where guys are at. Are there certain prospects that are, showing out, making a case, like how Bradley, how Jackson Blake did last season, Seth Jarvis a few seasons ago. Are they getting those opportunities that maybe it's a guy getting hurt or maybe they just really showed out and be like, I want to be here. And those guys had those opportunities, and Trent brought up, Seth Jarvis made the roster because Niederreiter was hurt and he showed up for the 10 games for him to stay in Carolina instead of getting shipped back to juniors with the Portland Winterhawks. And they look at Jackson Blake, who basically, played a couple games with the Hurricanes, and then, when he first, signed his ELC after playing in North Dakota. And then last year was like, he just forced his way onto the roster. And I think that's what you're kind of seeing in this game. So you see Bradley Nadeau, scoring his 4th goal, which unfortunately was taken off the board because apparently we have to do coaches challenges in the preseason, which is just like, what are we doing here? But, it was a goal scorer's goal. Unfortunately, it didn't count, but you get the sense that Bradley Nadeau just keeps getting better and better as, the preseason goes along. Alexander Nikishin gets a goal and assist, and it was kind of a slow struggle start for him in this one. But as the game went on, he kept getting better and better. And you can tell that he's kind of thinking a little too much, which, it makes sense for a guy who's only played 4 playoff games, is going through his first preseason and training camp with the Hurricanes. There's going to be some struggles. There's going to be some growing pains for a guy who's 23, first full season coming up on North American ice, still trying to learn the system, the language, stuff like that. But he had a pretty good game as well. Justin Robidoux had a really good game overall as well. A lot of board battles and stuff like that. And, Charles Alexa Legault had a really good preseason as well, making some key defensive plays. the Carolina Hurricanes kind of forced into overtime as well. And then you look at the PTO guys of like Kevin LeBanc, still making a strong case for himself, or Giovanni Smith scoring a goal, and he's been having a surprise, preseason. Like you guys heard me talk about on the Monday show. I was pleasantly surprised that he was actually, showing something that the Hurricanes kind of need, and that you kind of feel like that maybe he is making a push for, maybe it's a two-way contract. And I'm glad I just didn't know, because it felt like the roster was somewhat set, but he's kind of proving himself. So that's what you look at these preseason games. And yeah, he lost in overtime. I thought Nikita Kwap did a pretty decent job when he came into the game after Frederick Anderson played the first two periods. But like I said, you're looking at where your PTO guys are at. Are they fighting for roster spots? Are you looking at your young prospects? Are they also fighting for roster spots? Are they finding a way to tell the Carolina Hurricanes, hey, we actually might be ready and we want to fight for a roster spot? Because it's not guaranteed for, a guy like Tyson Jost if he's going to be in Carolina. He might start the season in Chicago. You look at, William Carey might be a healthy extra. You look at a Mark Jankowski as a healthy extra as well. That's if you bring another guy up. So it's like you're almost kind of forcing two roster guys who might have gotten starts on the roster might be going to be healthy extras for the team, if they're willing to try that. Because when you look at the lines right now with the Hurricanes just going through camp and stuff, you're talking about Ehlers, Aho, Jarvis, or maybe Svechnikov, Stankoven, and Blake. The Jorans with Carrier. Then it's Eric Robinson and, just Barry Kokoniemi, Taylor Hall as your fourth line. So it's very interesting to see when you look at where the Hurricanes are at right now. And, like I said, if you bring up, someone like Bradley Nadeau, which we'll talk about later on the show, like, what does that look like? So that's where the preseason games for me, it's, it'd be great if you get some wins, but it's like, who is kind of showing out? Who's making that case to be like, hey, I might be on a PTO, or hey, I'm a prospect that's, maybe 21, 20 years old, maybe, is trying to fight for that next roster spot. So it's good to see when you see a young team like Carolina go with basically an AHL roster, couple PTO guys thrown in there, and then you have your two NHL regulars, which is a goalie and a defenseman. You want to see the fight. You want to see where this team is at skill-wise. And, are they going to roll over, or are they going to push? And, yeah, while they got outshot pretty decisively in this game against the Panthers, a young team like the Hurricanes had on Monday night fought really hard to force an overtime game against the Panthers, and that's what you really want to see, is a team being able to do that. So it's a good indication of where you're at if you're the Carolina Hurricanes, that, yeah, you're not winning preseason games, but you're seeing what you're asking for out of these guys that are, fighting for contracts to stay with the Hurricanes in some aspect. Maybe if it is starting in Chicago, who cares? Like, that's fine. And you're looking at your prospects. How's your development? How are you with the system? Are you in the right spots we need you to be in? Are you making the right plays? Are you finding the right guys? Are you doing the things that we've been asking you for since you've been with the organization for maybe a year or a little bit longer? Because some guys have played 1 year with the organization last season. This is their second year, or they've been here for a couple seasons, and it's going to take time for some of the guys to develop. But for me, that's why I think that's where the preseason and training camp's it means differently for wins, losses than it is for, when it comes to the regular season. Because regular season, yeah, that's when it actually matters. But for preseason, it's just, where are you at when it comes to all of that? So I think it's just, where are you in terms of development, where your skill set's at, how are you with the system, all of that. So it's good to see you, like you said, you got Kevin LeBanc, who's kind of been showing out. Giovanni Smith has had a really good camp as well. Then you're looking at guys like Charles Alexis Legault who's had a pretty good preseason so far. Justin Robidas had some key moments. Bradley Nadeau is scoring goals, even if some were getting taken off the board. But in retrospect, he has 4 preseason goals, regardless if one got taken off. But he's shown a lot as well. You're looking at Ivor Rybkin, who's standing up for teammates after they get blown up in a game. So it's just, you're seeing a lot of early returns on some of these guys, and that's something that's very excited about. Now, that being said, with guys kind of showing out, the Hurricanes have been making some roster cuts as we are in the last full week of camp. So who are these roster cuts so far? Stick around and we'll talk about it here in a second on a Tuesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets used across the app. It makes watching football even more exciting. You got a little something riding on the action if you're watching your favorite team or maybe even just your fantasy team. Whether you're a casual fan or love diving into the stats, FanDuel makes the game day experience so much better. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. Welcome back to segment 2 of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day. So we kind of talked about the preseason game a little bit, stuff like that. What do these preseason games really mean overall when you're the Carolina Hurricanes? And now we kind of move on to a lot of stuff. It's what's going to happen a lot this week, not just for the Hurricanes, for across the league. It's going to be a lot of the roster cuts. Now, some teams have already been making a good number of, cuts to their training camp roster, which means some of these guys are, going to go back to their AHL teams, or maybe some are going to juniors, some maybe going back overseas. It just depends on what's going on with, where these guys are supposed to be going to. Now the Hurricanes have made a couple moves. They did a couple back on Sunday and had 5 more on Monday. Now, to start off back on the 28th, the Hurricanes reassigned Amir Miftakov and Ruslan Kasayev to the Chicago Wolves on Sunday, which it's no real surprise. I mean, when you look at those two guys, they were going to start in Chicago regardless. Could they have gotten possibly more preseason action? Possibly so, but when you look at probably like a guy like Nikita Kwap, he's going to go back to Germany for the second German league. So they're like, well, if we're going to keep, if we're going to have 4 guys, it wouldn't hurt to keep, have Kwap stay here for an extra couple of days, get some extra playing time, and then send him back over to Germany, where he's going to play in the Del 2 League. And then you look at Keaton Primo. Primo is it's realistically going to be the Hurricanes' 3rd goalie on the depth chart. So, yeah, you kind of want to keep him up here a little bit longer to get more ice time and get more familiar with the team, because in case of an injury, not going to let there isn't, he'll be ready to go when he comes up to Carolina, because right now he's the 3rd goalie behind Anderson and Kochetkov, which makes all sense. So if you're looking at 2 goalies that you need down in Chicago for the start of their camp, which starts here on Tuesday for the Chicago Wolves, it's good to have 2 of those 3 guys who should be getting some time getting used to Cam Abbott and those guys down there with the Chicago Wolves in their training camp. Now, then we had 5 more reassignments that happened on Monday. 2 of them, however, are placed on waivers with the intention of being reassigned to the Chicago Wolves. That is Skylar Brind'Amour and defenseman Ronan Seeley, which makes a lot of sense because they're out of options. You got to have to go through waivers with the purpose of being sent to Chicago. Do I see Brind'Amour or Seeley possibly getting claimed? I don't think so, but they have until the 2 p.m. deadline on Tuesday before we know for sure if a team claims them, or they make it outright and they can go to Chicago and start training camp with the Wolves. I don't think they will be, and not because of lack of talent and stuff like that, but I think a lot of teams kind of already have most of their roster set, and I think it'd be one of those things where I'd be kind of surprised if one of these 2 guys get claimed off waivers, but it just makes sense to have them go back because, your defense is pretty much set. There's a lot of other guys kind of up the pecking order, at least for Ronan Seeley. Skylar Brind'Amour, when it comes to his play, he's someone who knows what he needs to do. He's in the right spot. It's just getting the finish is what you kind of want to look for out of him, because he can do all the things right. His placement's right. His IQ is good and stuff like that. He wins you face-offs. It's just that next level of just at least trying to, assists, goals, stuff like that, which is fine. I mean, he's a more defensive-minded center, which is definitely what you need in your system and just on the team overall. But I think when it comes to Skylar Brunmore, there's just that little extra that you're kind of hoping to see. So, but there's nothing wrong with go playing the AHL because technically this would be his third full season in the American Hockey League. Because we talked about 2 seasons ago, he's with the Charlotte Checkers in his rookie year as a pro. Last year, he was with the Carolina Hurricanes. Now this year is his second, full go within the organization. Now, the 3 guys who did go outright to the American Hockey League because they didn't have to worry about going through waivers, defenseman Dominic Bendica, Dominic Fensori, and Alexei Himosami. Now, when it comes to Bendica, he is, he had 2 games with the Chicago Wolves last year, and after playing most of the season with the Malmö Redhawks of the, Swedish Hockey League. So it makes sense for him to kind of go to Chicago, get more acclimated to the North American game because he, like I said, he only played 2 regular season games with the Chicago Wolves last year after playing, 95% of the season over there in Sweden. So, it's going to be interesting to see how he does. I think he did pretty well so far in the preseason, but, when you've played a total of 2 games on North American ice, it makes sense that they're going to let you kind of, as Mike Maniscalco puts it, kind of let him bake in the oven a little bit more, kind of get you more used to the system and stuff like that. So it makes sense for him. Dominic Fensori had a really good season last year with the Wolves. The alternate captain comes back once again, and I think he's just going to continually build on his game as well. And I've honestly loved what he's done during the preseason and training camp for the Hurricanes this year. I think you see him have taken that next step as well. So it's really awesome to see Dominic Fensori, and I think he's only going to get better as well. Him, Charles Alexis Legault, those are the 2 guys I think really stood out in terms of the defensive prospects, not named Alexander Nikisha, because we all know Nikisha most likely is going to be with the Hurricanes. But if you're looking at other defensemen in the system who I think have taken that next step, for me it's Legault and also Dominic Fensori. And then the last guy, like I said, Alexei Himosami, first year in North American ice last year and season before, he was with Assat of the Finnish Liga League. And I think he's just another guy who's kind of slowly building himself up as well. I think he had a couple of good glimpses of some, action during the preseason. I think he made a couple plays there were like, okay, that's, something to look forward to, kind of to build on as well. So it'll be interesting to see how he does in Chicago as well. But those are the 5 guys that also got sent, or not really sent down, but reassigned, as they put it now, to the Chicago Wolves. So Dominic Bendica, Dominic Fensori, Alexei Himosami, and then waivers for outright purposes, Skylar Brunmore and Ronan Seeley, which means after that, the Hurricanes training camp roster is down to 25 forwards, 12 defensemen, and 4 netminders as of this recording on, when we're going into Tuesday. That's where we're kind of at with roster spots. Now, over the next few days, as Walt Ruff has put it out, that with the fact that the Hurricanes' last preseason game is Saturday, and you're talking 4 days worth of practices and stuff like that in between Tuesday and Friday, it's just 4 practices. You get your last tune-up on Saturday, and then it's just more practices after that as we get ready for the home and season opener next Thursday on the 9th. I would not be surprised if we see a lot more roster cuts over the next few days because the team needs to get down to 23 players. And there's some guys that are still fighting for those positions. And, there are some guys that are making those cases. Now, will they make enough case to make the main roster? Or for some of these guys who are on PTOs, have they done enough to possibly garner a 1-year, 2-way contract? And maybe in some cases, maybe they've got a roster spot that's hey, we want to make you our 13th, 14th forward because you've earned it. So that's kind of where you're at over the next few days is, with all these practices going on, what players have made a stronger case to make the roster? Is it a Bradley Nadeau? Did he do enough to crack the main roster? And even if it's 4th line minutes, or maybe he sneaks into the top 9, is he someone that the Hurricanes want to bring up and see what he can do? Because We all know he can score goals. He scored goals in the preseason, but did he do the other things necessary to put himself into that spot? I mean, he's 20 years old. There's nothing wrong with going back to Chicago too. But that being said, who are these possible guys that have maybe made that certain case to possibly make the roster or earn some contracts? Well, stick around and we'll talk about it here in a second on a Tuesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Welcome back to segment 3 of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day. Now, we kind of mentioned a little bit in segment 2 with the roster cuts of guys who are kind of trying to, make their case to possibly stay with the Carolina Hurricanes, making the main roster, or getting those contracts to kind of just stay within the organization in general. And I will say this, out of all the guys who've really made a case for themselves is Bradley Nadeau. Obviously, when you look at the prospect showcase, he kind of really showed out. He scored some goals, but he added a lot of extra grit, a lot of extra fight to his game as well, working on the PK, to try to see if he's someone that they could use there at some point, either at Chicago or in Carolina down the road. It'll be interesting to see what they do with Bradley Nadeau. Obviously, because we all know he can score goals. It's just can you do the off-puck stuff? Are you reading plays correctly? Are you putting yourself into a good spot defensively? Do you have the awareness on the defensive side along with the offensive side as well? Are you making the right passes, the right reads and stuff like that? So it's a lot of the non-scoring stuff that I think is what the Hurricanes are looking for in Bradley Nadeau. And, talking with Brian Henkel during one of these practices, that's what he was looking for too. It's just, are you doing the other non-scoring stuff to show that maybe you're ready for the NHL? Because it's a big jump. Because you're just going from the last couple of years, you're going from Penticton in the BCHL, making a massive jump to the NCAA with the Maine Black Bears, had a really good season. Then you have another jump to the Chicago Wolves last season. You go and score 32 goals, becoming one of a very handful of, teenagers to score 30-plus goals in the American. And now you're trying to do another next jump into the NHL. I think he's done plenty enough to show that he might be ready, but is he, I'm breaking onto this roster like a Jackson Blake or a Seth Jarvis ready? I'm not entirely sure, because if you bring him up, who are you really taking off the roster? And in that case, who are you taking out of playing time? Because you really can't do that to Eric Robinson, because he earned himself a 4-year contract with the Carolina Hurricanes after having a career season. And he adds speed and size that you definitely need. So I don't see them removing Eric Robinson. Are you taking Taylor Hall off the main roster? No, because you just paid him 3 years at over $3 million to stay in Carolina as well after he had a pretty good run with the Hurricanes. I don't see Taylor Hall being bumped off. Could you possibly see William Carrier being a healthy extra? Possibly, because he didn't really play a lot of games with the Hurricanes last season. I mean, you're paying him $2 million for another 5 seasons. Maybe that's a guy you bring in for certain instances for strategies and maybe getting some other guys some rest and stuff like that. So maybe it's William Carrier, because honestly, he's great, but I just don't know if you want to put him on a line with the Jordans, where with Martinook and Stahl, do you want to have 3 guys on your bruising line, but are you having facilitating the scoring? That's kind of the main question, because we know that Jordan Martinook can score goals. There's been the last couple seasons you've seen that he's gone on some runs and been on a heater a few times in the regular season. Jordan Stahl will score his goals as well. It's just, I don't know if you want to, because in this day and age with the NHL, I don't think you can have just a full line of guys who are basically going to bruise you and fight you off the puck, but not really give you 15, 20 goals a season. I just don't, that's not a line that screams that. And I just don't think in this day and age of where you're trying to build rosters to win a cup that you can have a line that's maybe giving you 12, 13, 14 goals with 3 guys each. Yeah, that adds up over time, but I think if you want, a guy who can score goals to facilitate, I think you're going to need someone who actually can possibly score goals being up there. So it'll be interesting to see if William Carey becomes an healthy extra, because I just don't see them doing it to Hall or Robinson for what they can do, because they got the speed, they got the size, they can facilitate pucks, pass the puck around. So if you do bring in a Bradley Nadeau, is William Carey going to be a healthy extra? Which I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's good to have depth like that for the Hurricanes because it seems like you need depth right now. So if Nadeau has done enough, I think he should kind of find his way onto the roster. If they play some, hey, we're going to put you on the fourth line with Kotkaniemi and Robinson, maybe move Hall to the third line, that's not a bad option either because, you don't want to throw him out there for so many minutes and, kind of break the confidence. If you want to ease them in, align with KK and E-Rob, wouldn't be a bad thing if you bring in Bradley Nadeau. So we'll see. I think Charles Alexis Legault has really shown himself really good. I mean, 6'4", 215. He's really put himself in a good position to where if something happens on the blue line, I think he'll probably be one of the first call-ups. Does he make it as the seventh defenseman? No, because I think they have Mike Riley there for a reason. But if anything does happen, I think Charles Alexis Legault might be your first defensive call because he's really shown himself through the prospect showcase, preseason games, and training camp as well. And I've been liking his game for a long time, even going back to last year. So I think he's kind of put himself into a really good spot when it comes to planting himself with the blue line at some point for the Hurricanes. Now we look at the PTO guys. You're looking at Giovanni Smith. You're looking at Kevin Labanc. Giovanni Smith has scored a goal in the preseason, but he's gotten into a bunch of fights, but he's standing up for his teammates. He's bringing a lot of fight to the team. He's bringing a lot of don't mess with my dudes, even if it's a PTO guy. So I think if, could he be a healthy extra for the Hurricanes? Possibly. But if you want to get within the organization and be like, hey, we need to call you up at some point or for whatever reason, I think getting Smith on a 1-year, 2-way deal is pretty good if you're the Carolina Hurricanes. I think he's earned himself at least a contract with the team. Main roster spot as a healthy extra. It's a possibility as well, but I think Giovanni Smith has at least earned himself a contract. I didn't know if he was going to make the main roster. I still don't know if he's going to make the main roster, but I think he put himself into a spot to where you've done enough to for the Hurricanes to give you a contract. I think that's what Smith has done. I liked the fact that he's not afraid to stand up for these guys, even the fact that he's a PTO player as of right now. So I think Smith is a guy who's probably earned at least a contract to be with the Hurricanes, even if it's a 1-year, 2-way deal. Same thing for Kevin Labanc. Kevin Labanc has really, shown why he has done what he's done with the Sharks, the Jackets, and all that stuff. And I didn't know if he was someone who's going to make the roster as well. And he could be another one of those guys that maybe sneaks onto the roster somehow, maybe supplants like Tyson Jost or what have you. But I think he's another guy that possibly has earned a 1-year, 2-way deal if the Carolina Hurricanes want to keep him as well. So I think just like Smith, I think Labanc has at least at the minimum earned a contract to stay with the Carolina Hurricanes. Past that for a roster spot, well, that's up to what Eric Tolsky, Rod Brindamore, and the coaching staff want to do. Do they think Kevin Labanc has earned enough to take a roster spot from someone to be a healthy extra? Is that taking Tyson Jost out of his spot? Who really knows? But I think at least for Smith and Labanc, I think those guys have at least earned themselves a contract to stay in Carolina. Past that, it remains up to the front office and the coaching staff. But I think they've done a lot too to make their claims to stay. So, like I said, Legault's put himself into a good spot to be one of the first call-ups on the defense. Bradley Nadeau, I think, has done enough to maybe warrant a conversation of maybe keeping him on the roster, but I think he's earned himself a possible first call-up for the Hurricanes if they need someone on the wings at least. Center-wise, probably still going to be, Ryan Suzuki in terms of, when he has someone to come up as a center. But if you're still looking at a winger to call up, I think Bradley Nadeau's done that. And with Smith and with Labanc, I think they've at least earned contracts to stay in Carolina. And Kane Primo, I haven't talked about him. He's someone that is clearly a third goalie. He's really shown out. I'm glad the Hurricanes are able to go trade for him. Yes, he's on a 1-year deal, and I think, honestly, don't be surprised at some point this season you might see a contract for Kane Primo, even if it's a 1-year, even if it's a 2-way contract. I still think he's probably is going to put himself in a good spot to get at least an extension to stay with the organization in some aspect. So that will be interesting to see what comes of that. But overall, we are 5 preseason games through. We got one more that's coming up on Saturday, and now it's just waiting for, watching practices and waiting for roster cuts when it comes to the training camp roster, because we are, as of Tuesday, 9 days away from the start of the regular season, Gary, for a lot of news when it comes to rosters and guys being ready to sign to some places or being released. So keep an eye out for that. Guys, this will be the Tuesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Thank you for making your first listen of the day. Here, second listen, check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast, where Steele Roden and Philip Livingston provide daily fantasy tips to give you the edge over your league mates, all while making you a smarter hockey fan. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or listen to your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you want to keep up with me, I'm at OneTrueZach on X. The podcast is LO_Hurricanes. I'm also on Blue Sky, Dave Zachary Martin, where if you click the link trees in my bios, you can find all of my written content at thehockeyriders.com. I've been putting out a lot of stuff recently, so make sure to get a check out on X. We have a lot more coming down the pipe over the next few days as well. If you want to check out my other podcasts, it's the Surgecast on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. For Locked On Hurricanes, we're on Spotify, Google, Apple, iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to your podcast. Make sure to leave a 5-star rating and review, because I might just read it on the show. For YouTube, Locked On Hurricanes, subscribe, hit the bell notification so you don't miss the show. Hit the thumbs up so you know if you like the show as well. Share with other Caniacs who become everydayers just like you. But hope everyone enjoyed the Tuesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Enjoy your Tuesday. And until next time, as always, let's go Canes.